Who hasn't been covering this off and on again over the past few months or so? $5,000, that's a pretty big fall. What are you talking about here?
Well, I think if you go back and look at the second half of 2017, is that after China came out and announced that they were going to effectively put controls and forbid ICOs, we had Bitcoin at the time at the end of August. It pulled from 5,000 down to 3, came back up to 5, and we really had this breakout that took place going into the end of the year with the move from 5,000 going up to almost 20,000. Now, granted, at that point in time, we had the creation of futures trading by the CME and the CBOE.
Right.
One would argue that, something's not a real market until you can actually short it. And with the futures, you may not necessarily be able to short outright, but you're at least moving more in that direction. But from a technical standpoint, we can say this move to 5,000, 20,000 created a huge gap. And typically, what happens around markets with breakout moves is that you need to have some backing and filling.
Right.
Now, clearly, we've had further announcements coming out of whether it's the South Koreans indicate that they may make a decision or not with regard, or you have, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin coming out and saying we can't necessarily have cryptocurrencies become the equivalent of a Swiss bank account. All the indications are there that something might be done. And from a trading standpoint, clearly, I think that, sentiment is driving the market. And why does sentiment drive the market? Because as of yet, we don't necessarily have mass adoption on the part of Bitcoin for payment purposes. We've had these moves in terms of pricing, but if you actually look at the underlying transactions in Bitcoin, they haven't gone up as much, which clearly indicates a type of speculative move.
Right.
Again, all these are elements that would argue that backing and filling might very well much be the order of the day until such time as we see a killer application develop for Bitcoin that lead towards greater mass adoption.
Now, we're seeing this rise in terms of ICOs, initial coin offerings here. The skeptic inside of me wants to ask how much of this is just opportunism to try to get on this bandwagon before it maybe falls further?
I haven't yet seen the Willie Sutton ICO come out, but Willie Sutton was very famous for the saying of, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. So if Willie Sutton were around today, he'd be issuing an ICO. But that said, we're looking with ICOs at potentially a broader adoption of blockchain, because you can have a blockchain application that could be used for a wide range of applications. In one case, they could be used to combat advertising fraud in digital advertising, which is about a $16 billion loss. There is an ICO called ClearCoin that's being used in that regard. And there's an actual use case, and there are actually customers that are using the technology now. Now, as investors go through and look at the ICO, you have to look far more closely, because these aren't registered with the SEC. They may not have standard disclosure.
Right.
You have to ask, is there a good underlying business use case? You have to be almost a venture capitalist in saying, what's the size of a total addressable market? Does this application actually make sense? We want to make sure that we're not out there buying the next doggy coin, which hasn't had a technology update in 2 years, and actually has $1 billion market cap.
I think $2 billion, in fact, from what I saw from earlier.
Okay, you might have seen it more recently than I. But nevertheless, something with a dog on it, which clearly is just a joke.
Right.
But nevertheless, someone's out there buying it. We have to prevent that.
David, I'm curious. You said 5,000. Why 5,000? I mean, do we have enough information to actually chart this thing?
Well, I'm just doing it more on a broad sense of seeing what the general levels from which there were actual moves over the last 6 months, and arguing that to the extent we had seen sort of this meteoric rise in the fourth quarter, going up almost 20,000. Again, now we've had more of an institutionalization of the market with the introduction of the futures trading coming out of the CME and the CBOE. As I said, we aren't necessarily at a point where we've got a fully blown market to the extent that we can't go out and basically short Bitcoin outright. But at least we can use the futures markets to try to approximate synthetic shorts in that regard.
Right.
We need to see how these play out. And I would argue that as things become more institutional, they perhaps become a little bit less suspect to the kind of frenzied enthusiasm that you might say has characterized the market to date.
David, what would you say are the signposts for those just getting in wanting to trade this thing? I mean, when you look at FX, I look at rate differentials. Equities, I look at earnings. What are the signposts or the sort of northern stars I should follow when I trade cryptos?
I mean, again, I would go back to the point of seeing, are price moves being supported by underlying transaction volume moves? Bitcoin is not necessarily, as we know, the only cryptocurrency that's out there. There are others, such as Ether, which are being used as a basis or a technology protocol on which to build other applications. Are we starting to see these killer applications, if you will, start to develop that lead to greater mass adoption relative to the blockchain protocols that are underlying and supporting these cryptocurrencies? To have a price move that's not really being matched by what's going on in the real economy in terms of driving activity in goods and services probably says that something is more of a speculative nature than something that has actual fundamental underpinnings. Clearly, you need to have the confirmation between if the prices are moving up, you need to see what's going on in the real world, so to speak.